Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Shatabisha Shetty. I am the director of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar for the launch of a new report exploring how Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the UK perceive current and future escalation risks in the Asia Pacific. This report is a culmination of a 2-year project that APLN has been running in collaboration with our sister organization, the European Leadership Network, which, like APLN, is a not-for-profit organization and a network of leadership figures focused on tackling existential risks and promoting better security, cooperation, and dialogue. For APLN, that work is focused in the Asia Pacific, and for ELN, that is in the Euro-Atlantic region. The aim of the first year of our joint project was to facilitate a dialogue amongst policymakers and experts from South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the UK to discuss common and competing threat perceptions and perceptions of strategic risks between the 4 countries. In the second year, we explored how these 4 countries perceive escalation risks related to the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. The analysis and recommendations from the second year's work is contained in the report, which we launched this week. This project was sponsored by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and we thank them for their support in this endeavour. Today, we will have a presentation on the analysis findings and recommendations from this new report by Dr. Rishi Paul, APLN Policy Fellow, and Yoel Peterson-Ivre, APLN Policy Fellow, 2 of the report's co-authors. This will then be followed by comments by senior experts from Japan, South Korea, and Australia. First up will be Ambassador Nobuyasu Abe, former UN Undersecretary General for Disarmament Affairs, former Commissioner of Japan's Atomic Energy Commission, and long-standing APLN member from Japan. Next will be Professor Gina Kim, who is Dean of the Language and Diplomacy Division at Hankook University of Foreign Studies in South Korea. Previously, she was Chief of the North Korean Military Division at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses and Adjunct Professor at Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies, and has been an advisory member from multiple South Korean government bodies, and is also an APLN board member. And last but not least, we have Professor Maria Ross-Rubeli, who is Professor of International Relations at the University of Melbourne, President of Women in International Security Australia, Executive Committee member of Women in Nuclear Australia, and is an internationally recognised award-winning academic and scholar, and an Australian APLN member. Finally, we will open up the discussion for comments and questions. We will add the links to the reports in the chat box so that you have access to the papers. And if you have any comments or questions throughout, please pop them into the Q&A box and we will address them during the discussion. And with that, I will now turn to Rishi Paul. Rishi.
Thank you, Shata. I'd like to begin to use my time to briefly outline the purpose of this project and why we feel that it's important. The risk of conflict in the Asia Pacific is becoming a concern for Australia, Japan, and South Korea, security partners, and main allies of the United States in the Asia Pacific, and to some extent, for countries outside the region with significant strategic interests in the region, such as the United Kingdom. The changing geopolitical dynamics in the Asia Pacific have produced shifts in defense policies, postures, and national security strategies, which include, but are not limited to, Australia's cooperation with the UK and US, and its planned acquisition of nuclear submarines through AUKUS. Japan acquiring counter-strike capabilities, doubling defense expenditure within 5 years, and developing hypersonic weapons, and South Korea's new Indo-Pacific policy and deepening alliance relationships to boost its defense deterrence capabilities, as well as maintain a mainstreaming of the domestic debate on nuclear disarmament. We felt these changes which have accelerated over the past year, necessitate developing and understanding how each country thinks about risks and its ability to deter threats and reduce risks. And we embrace this challenge by exploring how each nation seeks to prevent regional escalation scenarios, specifically North Korean military aggression against South Korea, or Japan and a Chinese attack on Taiwan, or a combination thereof. This is the framework that we use to classify risk perceptions. We try to get a sense of how each is likely for each country to see the risk of escalation in a 5-year time frame, and how directly they believe their country would be affected if that risk was realized. This exercise was meant to illustrate differences in risk perceptions between the 4 countries. The results, which Yol will speak to in a moment, were not a precise science, but a balanced judgment on our part based on a series of interviews with government officials spread across the Asia-Pacific states and UK, as well as members of the policy expert community. We also hosted 2 conferences, one in Japan and one in South Korea. To ensure participants could have a free and frank exchange, we limited the involvement of the US. Feedback received from participants indicated that this was the right approach. The project identified common ground between key UK partners on how Japan, South Korea, Australia develop responses to regional escalation scenarios, and increases understanding of potential unintended consequences and risks. Grounded in this context, the role of assurances surfaced as a key security need for participants, and many felt that more work needs to be done in this area. As Yol will discuss in more detail, we also found that there is some degree of consensus among participants from the 4 countries on the drivers of escalation risks in the Taiwan Strait. But opinions diverge, more notably between South Korean participants and the others regarding escalation risks on the Korean Peninsula. South Koreans consider this risk acute, whereas most others seem to consider the risk latent. Before discussing policy recommendations, I'll pass on to Yol, who will dive into the substance of our findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Rishi. Right. So yes, I will go through our findings for this project, and I will start with the risk perceptions of the Taiwan Strait. So here is a list of some factors that were brought up in relation to escalation in Taiwan Strait by the participants and interviewees that we engaged with in this project. On the left, we have several factors that were seen as increasing this risk, and China's personalist leadership, the lack of US-China crisis mitigation dialogue, too many Chinese red lines, and too much ambiguity on the US part, and too few red lines were considered risk factors, as well as a potential weakening of the Chinese no first use norm. There were disagreements, however, on the influence on the Ukraine war on the Taiwan risk. Does Russia's experience serve to deter China, or does it serve to encourage it, or is it too early to tell? These were all different views that we encountered throughout this project. Some views indicated that the US extended deterrence presented some entanglement risks, but generally US extended deterrence was seen as the kind of stopgap for any crisis or further escalation in the Taiwan Strait. There were also some other considerations, such as the risk of nuclear fallout on China, or normative considerations on how nuclear use would be viewed throughout the world. But US extended deterrence was kind of the main thing that most participants brought up. Here's an example of how Japan perceived the impacts of escalation in the Taiwan Strait. This is, of course, not a complete universe of possibilities, but Japanese interviewees highlighted the impact often as mediated through public opinion, and especially public opinion of the alliance with the United States. Chinese strikes on Japanese territory or even just the threat of nuclear use could drive the Japanese public to push for war termination, which could negatively affect the alliance with the US. Alternatively, if the US intervened and failed to stop a takeover of Taiwan, or did not intervene at all, that could also have a negative impact on both public and elite opinion in Japan. And that could also call the alliance into question. In both cases, the results for Japan would be disastrous. And if we compare this then with Australia, we see that there was an acknowledgement of some direct impact on Australian security, but less than Japan. Some impact included, for example, strikes on Australian bases on US bases or joint bases in the northern part of the country, and that this might happen whether Australia provided rearguard support or direct support. And there were different opinions on this. But the extent of the impact on Australia was not seen as being as deep as it was perceived in Japan. It certainly did not seem to trigger the same almost existential anxieties that could be gleaned from the responses of Japanese participants in this project. In fact, some Australians even argued that the risk of escalation and the impact of that on Australia had been much inflated in Canberra lately. In any case, the point here was not for us to measure the risk in an absolute sense, but how these countries perceive escalation risks compared to one another. I've only talked about Japan and Australia here, but we can discuss South Korea and the UK later if you like. We believe it's fair to say that Japan sees a conflict in the Taiwan Strait as somewhat more likely within the next 5 years and having a higher impact on its security than Australia does, for example. The arrows in this figure, they show just how we judge these perceptions to change as interviewees were asked to extend the 5-year timeline we gave to them. And in some cases, they requested to extend their predictions as well. When Australians were asked about the likelihood of a Taiwan crisis over the next 10 or 15 years, they deemed it as much more likely and as having much more impact on Australian security, especially as concerns about US long-term reliability grew more apparent, or if you questioned the reliability of the US. However, we did not discuss, for example, entanglement risks, which might actually decrease in such a scenario, but that's something we could come back to later. Again, these arrows are notional. They provide a visualization of our argument, and it's not to provide any objective measurement of this risk. Overall, we see an alignment on the perception of the likelihood of a crisis in Taiwan Strait. So not likely in 5 years, but increasing thereafter. We see less alignment on the perceived impact of such an event, though, and that's probably given the geographical distances involved. And that's perhaps not too surprising, but it does have some implications for policy coordination, which will be more apparent as I turn to the second case, which is the Korean Peninsula. So here, our participants generally agreed that North Korea's revised nuclear posture since September 2022 and closer cooperation with China, but mostly with Russia, could increase the risk on the Korean Peninsula because it enhanced North Korea's capabilities. Everyone more or less agreed that Kim Jong-un is a rational actor, but whether or not he can be trusted to remain so in a crisis, that was more up for debate, and it goes back to the concerns about the revised nuclear posture. South Korea's preemptive strike doctrine and claims of massive punishment and retaliation were also considered escalatory by Japanese interviews in particular. Some South Koreans also agreed with this, but the existence of this doctrine seems to suggest that in Seoul there are those who consider it to be stabilizing, and this included some of our interviewees as well. And finally, and this was a Korean concern, escalation in the Taiwan Strait was considered as a trigger in itself. It could trigger North Korean opportunism, for example, but interviewees disagreed on how great this risk actually was. Again, US extended deterrence was seen as a backstop of risk by participants from all countries, but then again, there were also some concerns of whether the US would use force or use nuclear weapons without consulting with their allies as well. So also some entanglement risks here. This chart here is just to drive home a very simple point that was made by many Koreans in this project, that North Korea presents an existential risk to us if matters escalate. Some even went so far as to call it a life or death implication. Whereas if you look at Japan, there was slightly different evaluation. Japanese were often viewed that conventional escalation might not have such a direct impact on Japan, might not even, the conflict might be contained to the peninsula. But they did view nuclear escalation as a big concern. Some Japanese experts even argued that North Korea might have a lower threshold of nuclear use towards Japan than they would have against South Korea. And just to compare with Australia and UK, and you can see that they mostly considered any escalation on the Korean Peninsula in more indirect terms. And this is probably based on the larger geographical distances. And except, of course, the effect on Australian or UK nationals residing in Korea. They were, of course, concerned about the impacts on that instability in the region would bring, and especially if coupled with nuclear use. But some Australian interviewees also argued that AUKUS could potentially present a way for Australia to be entangled into a risk on the Korean Peninsula. But there was much less consensus on this compared to Taiwan, and there was not really consensus there either, but it was something that more people were inclined to believe. From UK perspective, they saw as a partner to these countries that they might be the subject of cyber attacks. But there was also some opinions among UK respondents that UK could even conduct counter cyber attacks against North Korea in this kind of scenario. So this is how we map the relative risk perceptions to one another on the Korean Peninsula. All acknowledged the likelihood of a risk increasing over the next 5 years, but generally participants were much less keen on making predictions on the immediate future than in the Taiwan case. South Korea is somewhat of an outlier here in terms of the impact of an escalation on the Korean Peninsula. South Koreans feel a sense of urgent danger from North Korea that other countries do not seem to share. Some Australians actually said that they think that South Koreans may even be deliberately inflating this risk. So there seems to be some measure of misperception between both of them. So here are 4 implications that we take out of these findings, and obviously there could be more, and I would be very happy to answer any questions about those. First of all, as I was alluding to here before, there are different priorities over the Korean Peninsula, and but mostly these 4 countries are quite aligned on Taiwan Strait, at least when it comes to the likelihood of a conflict or an escalation taking place. Japan, Australia, and UK overall are fairly aligned on risks, although they naturally diverge on the degree of impact. And thus, one might think that they could also diverge on the amount of resources that they might dedicate to a potential conflict. Do they need to speak more without the United States in the room? This was a question that we asked ourselves after having several, the 2 roundtables that we arranged. By design, we limited US participation, but and Americans tend to fall into a sort of coordinating role, which is also the traditional security role of Americans in the region. But there was a clear preference of resolving matters by working with the US as opposed to working with any of the other countries. And this goes back to the faith in US extended deterrence, which was overwhelmingly, there was faith in extended deterrence, but there were some concerns about retrenchment as well. We did not address specifically what US retrenchment would look like from the point of view of these countries, but that's a question that we should probably consider further. And the final point here is related to the third. And it's hardly surprising, but it's the fact that deterrence takes preeminence over multilateral arrangements or international treaties. Strengthening the faith in the nuclear non-proliferation regime is urgent, but and we saw a kind of a difference between officials and between experts, where officials tended to express a lot of support in the NPT and the non-proliferation regime overall, and experts were more mixed in their judgments of that, and perhaps they're also more free to speak their minds. So with that, I'll leave it back to Rishi, who will speak to some of our recommendations for addressing these implications. Thanks.
Thanks, Yol. So the critical role of the US as a policy coordinator is emphasized by all countries who rely on American alliance managers to set the agenda and provide extended deterrence priorities. But despite this reliance, some states are beginning to question US reliability and therefore seek to enhance their conventional capabilities. The emphasis on deterrence, both nuclear and conventional, it tends to diminish the appeal of inclusive multilateral approaches to maintaining stability in favor of smaller, purpose-built, minilateral configurations. Given the limited experience that these four countries have when managing multilateral security discussions, especially absent the US, the question then becomes, well, how should they go about it? And we offer a few preliminary recommendations. So on policy coordination, there is a clear need for the three Asia-Pacific countries and a clear interest on the part of the UK to enhance their policy coordination and align and understand each other's risk perceptions. This is in terms of their likelihood that a risk will materialize and the consequence that would follow should a risk materialize. So first, they could increase alertness. Countries should continually reassess strategic risks and remain aware of the moving parts. This can include joint annual surveys to compare risk perceptions, continuously modeling the interplay between emerging technologies and conflict stability, and risks of escalation, and engaging in Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues to coordinate on security matters. Secondly, improving coordination. Asia-Pacific partners should enhance capacity building and networking among experts. This can occur through dialogue intended to increase predictability among security partners, analysis of how legal and normative frameworks can be used to reduce tension around Taiwan and North Korea, and joint scenario-based exercises that improve understanding of one another's reactions to risks. And finally, updating the security agenda. Policymakers should refocus their attention on North Korea's nuclear activities, offering more explicit guarantees to South Korea while also providing North Korea with incentives to curtail nuclear activities and provocation policies. This approach should also reduce proliferation pressures in South Korea and help bolster strategic stability in Northeast Asia. On developing and communicating assurances, they could first leverage the P5 process. As a power with a very small military footprint in the region, the UK could leverage its diplomatic clout within the P5 process and play a coordinating intermediary role here by fostering a dialogue aimed at better understanding threat perceptions. It could foster Track 2 dialogues on specific issues such as the interaction of emerging technologies and assurances that are related to its current tension, but may also lie at the core of ongoing disputes as a European partner. The UK could also impress on its regional partners the importance of continued dialogue, even under difficult circumstances. Secondly, strengthen coordination in developing a unified approach towards assurances. A coordinated approach to bringing assurances into deterrence relationships is key if such efforts are to be effective. China and North Korea might otherwise be able to pick off countries and exploit gaps between their policies or between their policies and those of the United States. The significant economic and strategic interests Canberra, Seoul, and Tokyo have with China should strengthen a foundation for such a conversation. But all three countries must better coordinate amongst themselves to renegotiate the terms of bilateral relations with Beijing. We have seen some of this coordination in this week's trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, and China. The same is true for relations with North Korea. But while all three security partners share a concern about China's posture, South Korea is currently the only regional country that considers North Korea as a policy priority. Greater prioritization of North Korea by South Korea's partners could help not only policy coordination, but also reduce the sense of insecurity that is causing the public and some policymakers to consider nuclear weapons. Third, and finally, prioritize reciprocity in assurances. Assurances from security partners in the region necessitate corresponding assurances from China and North Korea to be practically meaningful and politically acceptable. Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the UK should clarify what trustworthy Chinese and North Korean assurances would look like. The UK could inform such a discussion based on its historical experience in building trust, reciprocal agreements with the Soviet Union. So this is just a snapshot of some of the recommendations that we've identified. With this, I'd like to pass back to Shatta. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, Yuval. And I will now turn to our expert commentators, with first being Ambassador Abe.
Thank you. Thank you for the very succinct, comprehensive presentation of the reports and its recommendations. I think the report is overall quite sound and comprehensive, and the recommendations are very well balanced and sound ones again. If I may say about the Japanese situation, I think in Japan, experts and the policymakers are more concerned about the security situation on the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait than the general public. One example of that difference was a case of the building of ground-based Aegis missile systems in Japan. There were proposals and works were about to start, but there were stronger local resistance from the people. And eventually the government had to give up the ground-based Aegis system. So that shows the perception gap between the population in general in Japan and the government experts on the other side. Otherwise, all the recommendations, I think, are quite sound and plausible. If I may say, in the future, this policy coordination and exchanges among the 4 participating countries, experts and the government officials, may go further deeper into the more concrete questions. For example, in the case of Japan, should there be any crisis in Taiwan Straits, should Japanese forces directly engage in the military operations? That's a big question. How do people in these 4 countries see this question? Also, when there's a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, should Japanese forces engage directly in protection of South Korea? There's an even more complicated question because of the historical, emotional sentiments on the part of the South Koreans. Some of them simply do not want to see Japanese soldiers on the ground. So that complicates the situation like that. So we need to have more frequent, closer policy coordination between the policymakers and the experts. But a little more difficult thing is how to influence the perceptions of the general public. That perhaps may be a little more difficult than coordination of the views between the experts and the policymakers. I may make a few more comments about a couple of things. One, AUKUS was mentioned. as a sort of regional cooperation. Okay, I can understand the reason to intensify cooperation among the Australia, UK, and the US, and also the desire of Australians to get nuclear submarines. The unfortunate thing is that the kind of submarines being provided to Australia are based on high enriched uranium. It would have been a lot better if it was low enriched uranium. But because it is high enriched uranium, I don't doubt the Australian non-proliferation commitments, but this precedent may be abused by other countries. For example, to justify them to acquire high enriched uranium, saying, no, this is not for weapons, this is for submarines propulsion. So that makes a situation very difficult, and that's a point I don't like. Another point, Japanese defense spending increase and Japanese intention to acquire counter-strike capability were mentioned. Yes, I think Japan is moving toward that direction. In the sense for Japan to make good use of any counterattack offensive weapon systems, it becomes very important for Japan to get virtually real-time precision information on the target country, for example, North Korea. That is very hard for Japan to obtain. So for that reason, Japan needs closer, more intensive information cooperation with South Korea and the United States. And for that reason too, increased, intensified policy coordination between Japan and South Korea will be very important. And last of all, I very much like the idea of suggestion to bring back North Korea into discussion. I think many people have been already given up. North Koreans are going to get nuclear weapons anyway, and they're going to strengthen their nuclear deterrence. Well, by bringing back the discussion about North Korea into our discussions, I think we can help allay the concerns of South Koreans. And by that, we can somehow reduce South Korean appetite to acquire nuclear weapons for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Abe. I will turn straight away to Professor Kim.
Yes, thank you. First of all, congratulations on the publication of new report. Well, the report rightly pointed out the diverse views each country holds regarding regional risks. And it also noted that varying risk perceptions are very closely related to different threat perceptions. So the report drew a very important implication that different approaches can reduce the ability to coordinate policies among key regional partners. I think that is a very good point. But I wish the report has gone further than describing each country's views on the likelihood of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait. Perhaps an analysis of different views on regional crisis using Delphi method could potentially produce a very, very interesting outcome. It's an interview technique based on a result of multiple rounds of questions sent to interviewees, observing the change of their reactions to other responses. So it's just my recommendation for the next project. And I have some minor points that I would like to make. The differences between South Korea and Japan on how to respond to regional crises, such as those in the Taiwan Strait, are not simply due to different threat perceptions of China. They also stem from the fundamentally different roles of the US military in Japan and South Korea, and the distinct purposes for which the ROG-US and Japan-US alliances were established from the beginning. So it would have been nice to analyze how the differing alliance structure or postures can shape our positions on regional crisis scenarios. And the report highlighted abandonment issue, which is also very, very important. It noted that U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific share concerns about possible U.S. retrenchment from the Asia-Pacific. And the fear of abandonment is inherent, actually, in any alliance relations. So in addition to that, how this is perceived by third parties like China, Russia, and North Korea, I think that question is very, very important, because which country is more concerned about the miscalculation by these countries will be ultimately affecting regional countries' security anxiety. And regarding North Korea's new nuclear doctrine, this report quoted a North Korean expert who said a nuclear strike could be automatically executed when the nuclear command and control system is threatened by an enemy's attack. However, according to North Korea's new law, there are many other conditions for nuclear use, which include aiming an attack against the leadership, strategic targets, and mass population. So the doctrine also mentions operational necessities, such as preventing the escalation and prolongation of the war, etc. But many experts still believe North Korea's primary objective is to deter any of these situations from occurring. And the situation that North Korea is describing in this revised law is actually counter-value strike. So everything is about strategic calculation anyway. And some experts argue that North Korea will use nuclear weapons early in a conflict for region survival. However, in my opinion, there is something inexplicable in this logic. There's something that does not make any sense, because if North Korea feels so-called use or lose pressure, it must be convinced that the early use of nuclear weapons will lead to any kind of victory. But the use of nuclear weapons will escalate to an all-out war, which North Korea will lose anyway. So what's missing here is some clarity on the type of nuclear use being discussed. And I still believe that trilateral cooperation between North Korea, China, and Russia in peacetime is quite different from opportunistic trilateral cooperation aimed at instigating dual crisis in this region. What appears to be a regional bloc is durable under the conditions of the ongoing war in Ukraine, for example, but it is still limited in scope when we are talking about security or military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And China and Russia's ultimate priority is probably avoiding entrapment or entanglement caused by North Korea. So that's the question that I'd like to pose to the authors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will now turn to our third commentator, Professor Rubley.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the report. For those of you in the audience who haven't read it, I strongly urge you to do so. I think it's excellent, and I think the policy recommendations are extremely sound, and perhaps not. I don't think you'd call them provocative, but perhaps not everyone would necessarily agree with them. But what they do is they raise a lot of food for thought. I have three main points that I want to discuss, and I've set an alarm so I don't go over time. And I think for all of these, if I have very little criticism of the report. The only thing I think I would have changed about it is to stress in the policy recommendations that these are all actually countries can pursue them in their own selfish interest. A lot of this talks about the importance for these three countries with facilitation and coordination by the UK, to work together more closely. And it seems, cooperative and collaborative, but it's also doing this is really in the best interest of each of these three countries. So for example, I think, the working together on having, track 1.5, track 2 dialogues, having surveys of elites, updating, because the situation is changing a lot. I think that's a really excellent recommendation, and one that I would strongly endorse. And I think the underlying goal there is to build strategic empathy among the three countries along with the UK. I think this is really critical if we want to, given the historical divisions in the region, the sense of history, the fact that Australia tends to look to the US first before countries in the region, for good reason. But, we need to build up a sense of community and strategic community. And the best way to do that is to get together early and often, and not just at the official level, but at the unofficial level too. And, track 1.5, track 2, and actually track 3 as well. I think Ambassador Abe's point about, what does the public think? And the public opinion actually can have effects on these types of decision making. The importance of public diplomacy among these three countries. And again, with the UK, I just say 3, but, I think the UK is in a perfect position to facilitate, coordinate, and to get involved. And, public diplomacy so that, the ordinary person on the street can see the importance of these collaborations, so that strategic empathy can be built from, both top to bottom and bottom to top. Because I think one of the really interesting findings was that this hub and spoke model of the US, it's not just something that imposed by the US, but it's something that country policymakers seem to prefer. That they'd actually sort of, let's see what the US thinks, or let's let the US coordinate that. And that is something that's going to take time to change. And I think now's a great time to be working on that. And one particular area where I think that strategic empathy needs to be built up is around red lines. And that's an area where, we're not, different countries may not be aware of what's a red line and what's not, where might, direct involvement, military involvement, from various countries take place. And, the Japanese perceptions on what South Korean red lines are, may not particularly be, what the South Koreans think. So, and I think this will also help. And another one of the really interesting findings of the report, South Korea right now feels like it has to go it alone in a number of ways. And I think that building this strategic empathy and strategic community can help alleviate that. My next point is around one of the findings about sort of minilateral versus multilateral solutions in the region. And as we all know, the idea of an Asian NATO, like, it sounds great, like, oh, it could just solve our problems here. But there's good reasons why there's not a NATO in Asia, and it's unlikely for those reasons. They're not going to be shifted anytime soon. And I think it would we'd have to have a very big shock to the system that could bring countries together in that way. And of course, we don't want that kind of shock, like that would not be a positive thing. And so, we've been turning to minilaterals, and not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in, around the world, minilaterals, and not just in security, but, environmental, trade, et cetera. So this is not just a trend in our region in this topic. And there are definite benefits to minilaterals. They can be bespoke design, they can be flexible, you can target the participants who have the most interest and the most ability to participate. They can be quite efficient because you're not having to sort of have consensus on issues. But I'd like to emphasize, and I think one thing that the report could do more. I think there should be additional research in this area. What are the minilaterals? What's the function of minilaterals in the security region in the Indo-Pacific? How do they reduce risk? How might they actually increase risk? because minilaterals have significant risks as well. It's not just all, all positive benefits. They tend to be quite exclusionary on purpose. And that can create a lot of resentment, not just among those who might feel targeted. For example, China feels targeted by AUKUS, but among partners who haven't been invited to be part of. And this, can actually erode this sense of strategic community that we're trying to develop. The other, another large risk of minilaterals that we need to be careful of is that they come with a lot of domestic political fragility. That is, the things they promise, because they're not backed by treaties, they're just sort of these ad hoc arrangements. If domestic politics shifts within a country, whether because of an election or change in public sentiment or budgetary concerns, then countries can pull out very quickly or quickly drop back their level of involvement and commitment. And so we want to be careful about relying too much on minilaterals and seeing them as, the solution to our problems. And, in that way, I think we need to reemphasize countries' self-interest in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think, countries do tend to take it for granted. And I don't think they realize that without the NPT, how in the world, how do IAEA inspections happen without the NPT? I mean, I know they're not technically linked, but can you imagine a world without the NPT in which IAEA inspections are still occurring on a regular basis without problems, the way that they happen today? The NPT actually makes it, have socialized countries, that nuclear weapons are something that uncivilized states do. And without that norm, we could see a rapid proliferation around the world, not just, and so, when I've talked with colleagues in South Korea, just informally, it's not a choice between South Korea getting nuclear weapons or not. It's a choice between South Korea getting nuclear weapons and then suddenly a bunch of other countries in the region. I think it would be very unlikely for South Korea to acquire nuclear weapons and no other countries in the region to get them, let alone around the world. We could talk about Brazil, for example. My final point, so in other words, we don't necessarily appreciate it because it's been around so long and the effects of it are so strong. And if it degrades or collapses, it could really lead us to, unintended consequences that none of us want. And so reaffirming the value of the NPT to country self-interest, I think is really important. And then finally, just quickly, my last point is that I know APLN has done a lot of research on this along with the partner ELN, is that, whenever I see, in the different charts where experts and policy officials said, well, if there's nuclear conflict, it could just be indirect effects on us. I just want to say there are no indirect impacts if we have nuclear war in the region. All of these countries are going to be affected just by the humanitarian consequences alone, by nuclear fallout alone. The humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, even a small nuclear exchange, research by IPPNW has shown that it could lead to nuclear winter, where we have reduced growing seasons and we could have mass famine. And APLN has done modeling on this as well. And so I think this is another area where we need to emphasize that there are no indirect impacts. I mean, if there's nuclear war, all the countries in the region are going to be affected quite strongly because of the humanitarian impacts, because of the effect on climate, let alone economic effects, effects on, military alliances, et cetera. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I might turn back to our two report authors who are speaking today for initial comments before opening up to Q&A and discussion. So first, I'll turn over to Yoel.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there are more points than I have time to respond to. So I'll just pick and choose a few that I feel that I have a good answer to. So I think it was interesting. Ambassador Abe spoke about challenging this finding that that China is not as important to Japan's security as North Korea. My understanding is that this could be potentially true if you look in a very immediate sense, or if you look backwards. We were trying to look very much be more forward-looking and see what are the threats that are emerging in the next few years. And there was definitely a bigger emphasis on China there. But that said, there were definitely some concerns about North Korea as well. So with this chart, we put Japan here and South Korea there and so on. It's not to imply that any of these threats are in any way unimportant to any of the countries. It's just that how they weigh them relative to one another can be quite significant. I had a few more. I think Professor Kim had one question. Excuse me, I'm taking notes over several pages. Yes, cooperation in peacetime is different than wartime when it comes to China and China, Russia, North Korea triangle, or the so-called triangle. I would agree. I think that in some ways it is this kind of trilateral relationship is hyped up a little bit, and it feels more like even though the Russia-China triangle is very kind of leg of that triangle is very strong. I don't feel like that has a lot of they agree a lot on exactly how to support North Korea. And again, China and North Korea are allies. They have never done any military exercises together. So I also think that that's why we brought up this word of opportunism in the report, that North Korea might make use of something that happens in Taiwan because it's a good opportunity to do so, but they are probably not going to coordinate it with China. And my understanding is, although I don't study Taiwan in particular, is that there's a kind of a reverse concern among decision makers and experts in Taiwan as well, that China might use something opportunistically if North Korea were to initiate something. So go back to that question of the primary objective is deterrence. True, and something I could have probably stressed more in this presentation is that for all the risks that people see on the Korean Peninsula, unintentional escalation is the one that's how people envision something to happen. So just to say that personally, I don't think that North Korea is looking to make a first strike out of the blue or something to that effect. Just back to Maria, who made several good points. I might mull on those a little bit because they're the ones that are most fresh in my mind. Just to also, agree with the empathy and the self-interest. In the interviews, again, this is something that South Korean officials tell us, it's in our interest and we have no plans on leaving. So that's very reassuring. But then when you speak more with experts, there is much more skepticism towards this. So I think that makes me also a little bit concerned that that maybe if officials were more free to speak their minds, they may think something differently. At least I've heard at least one South Korean official use the word life support, and this seems to be a word that's used a lot in association with the NPT. And it's a cliche that I think is not useful for anyone's purposes to bring about. It's not about that it's on life support. We need to actually think about how we can provide the life support and nurse it back to health. So I'll think a little bit more about what you were saying, Marie, and then I'll have a more well-articulated response soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel. Turning over to Rishi.
Thanks, Shatter. So yes, all great comments. Thank you very much. Made a few notes, and I'd like to pick up on 4 of the points. First, on trilateral cooperation, which would be different in times of crisis. I think that's absolutely correct, and perhaps something that the report didn't quite stress enough, that this idea of cooperation in peaceful time will not go as far as outlining the conditions that would warrant involvement of extended deterrence partners like the United States. I think that were a crisis to erupt on the Taiwan Strait or the Korean Peninsula, I think the US involvement would be critical and would differ significantly to what we consider would be their involvement in peacetime. So to put it into context, I think that the UK in particular would play a role, but based on our interviews, UK participants, especially officials, were quite sanguine about the level of a commitment that could be made. At the moment, the problem being, of course, that Europe is already embroiled in a war in the Ukraine conflict, and so there is a problem of capacity and resources. So if there were to be a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, it is possible that the UK would be limited in the level of involvement, but the UK has stressed that they are committed to being allied security partners. And I think with the US, it's slightly different in the sense that the US practices studied ambiguity. So on the point that was made on red lines, one of the participants that we interviewed said, well, China has put too many red lines and the US too few. And I think that's absolutely correct. But I think this goes to how the US approaches its strategy in the region and more broadly as a nuclear possessor. Red lines have always been somewhat problematic from their perspective. It depends on what side you sit. If you put a red line and your adversary crosses that red line, then you have no choice but to respond. And if you don't, it undermines future credibility of deterrence. But in situations, in the current context of Taiwan, it's slightly different in the sense that extended deterrence guarantees are relied upon, and how they are communicated is of vital importance. And I think that whereas in the Cold War, it was the issue with extended deterrence was that would the US truly commit to trading Boston for Berlin? The same applies, the same question can be asked, would the US trade, Washington for Seoul? And so this is slightly problematic in the sense that now with the US elections coming, this problem of retrenchment, if Trump comes in with a second administration, if he withdraws further, then it does create this sort of strategic space which China can manipulate, which then brings on to this whole observation on the Asian NATO, which is a way for the Asia-Pacific partners to coordinate and communicate with one another through shared risk perceptions. But there is the issue of would nuclear weapons be introduced into this arrangement, which in itself would be hugely problematic, not only undermining the NPT and the norm of non-proliferation, but it's also a question of escalation, that if suddenly a Asian NATO style arrangement were arranged and it did involve nuclear weapons, then it increases crisis instability. It doesn't decrease it necessarily. And I think that it's a very steep learning curve, and it would be very different to the NATO experience with the Soviet Union. But what would be similar would be seeing a return to nuclear escalation. And I think this is the crux of the issue. So, I mean, I don't think South Korea would go in that direction. I agree with Marie. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think an Asian NATO can be different from the NATO that relies on nuclear weapons. It just requires coordination of security policies, more track 2 involvement in discussions, more surveys, more wargaming in this area, understanding risk perception to filter into the public sphere, not so much remain in the policy elite arena. And I think this is key to it, which brings on to strategic empathy. And I think this is actually a difficult one, because strategic empathy is a really difficult thing to communicate if your adversary doesn't want to communicate with you. So, the Asia-Pacific states are, from my understanding, willing to discuss this, But discussing it with China requires an enormous political hurdle to be overcome. I mean, I think, given the current climate, it is looking increasingly unlikely. China is maintaining a position at the moment which makes engagement extremely difficult. The nuclear expansion is problematic in the sense that it is creating asymmetries in risk perception. And I think strategic empathy is something that at present will not be possible, but something with a view to the intermediate future might be. I have other observations, but I think it's probably best if I leave it there. But I am happy to actually put it in writing and to send it out later to everyone if that helps.
Thank you, Rishi. I think we will open it up to the wider group discussion now. We have a few questions in the Q&A box. 3 from one person, Issa Tusar. So I might direct these to our expert commentators along with our panelists. So there's a question: how do historical events shape current risk perceptions in the Asia-Pacific region? Now, I might direct this to Ambassador Abe, given that you slightly touched on this in your earlier remarks. We have another question: how do regional security concerns such as territorial disputes and military tensions influence policy coordination in the Asia-Pacific? Now, I might turn this to Professor Kim and give you time to think about a response to that. And then another question is: what social risks, including population aging and migration, are of concern to Asia-Pacific nations? This is slightly beyond what we're doing in this particular report, but Maria, if you don't mind trying to tackle that question, if you can, I'll send that over to you. And then one additional question, which is, given that some time has elapsed since the interviews took place for this project, how do you think that the new developments in terms of political changes in relevant countries could impact the analysis, and would these have an impact? So I might send that to Yuval. So I'll turn first to Ambassador Abe on the historical events.
Thank you. I think in terms of analysis of the way potential adversary behaves, I think a historical analysis of North Korean behavior would be quite useful. There have been so many cases, precedents, and some experts have already drawn a number of conclusions, but I think that's useful. In terms of Taiwan Straits, there's not so much history to it. And thinking about the possible crisis on Taiwan Straits, I think the influence of the Ukraine war may be quite great. It's all in the domain of speculation, but how the Chinese think that they can use military forces to stop Taiwanese independence or absorb Taiwan or so and so, having seen what happened in the Ukraine. If they see it that Russians did it, so why not China? That's quite a dangerous way they see it. But I hope they should learn that it was easy for Russians to invade Ukraine and attack Ukraine because of land connected. They can easily shell Ukrainians from Russian territory. They can go in quite easily. But between Taiwan and China, there's the sea, rather wide open sea, and that makes it far more difficult for China to invade Taiwan. So I hope they learn from the Ukrainian experience. As far as Japan is concerned, history with South Korea is more or less roadblock for promoting cooperation between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next question on how do regional concerns such as territorial disputes and military tensions influence policy coordination in the Asia Pacific. So Professor Kim.
Yes, actually, non-security issues matters. Actually, this report stresses coordination among key players in this region. And the prospect of, for example, ROC-Japan security cooperation is rather exaggerated, considering the fundamental reservations among South Koreans about bilateral cooperation with Japan without addressing other contending issues like historic textbook, territorial issues over Dokdo, forced labor issues, treated water issues, to name a few. So after the general election in April, and the start of a new National Assembly with more progressive members, well, the current South Korean government will be under pressure to slow down its cooperation with with Japan, obviously. And about China, South Korea's concern about entanglement comes from its security anxiety about China's military move in retaliation. Location-wise, it is closer than any other U.S. allies. China sometimes use a show of force in the form of military exercise in the West Sea, the water between China's east coast and South Korea's west coast. It is always an alarming factor for South Korea. So yes, South Korea's response to regional crisis is largely affected by its other security concerns.
Great, thank you very much. And then the other question on social risks and how are these of concern to Asia Pacific nations? Maria.
Yes, well, I love this question. I think that there are significant social risks, and we talk about security, sort of hard security and human security, and actually they all sort of meld together. So we have not just migration, aging populations, low birth rate, questions around refugees, the potential for climate refugees. I mean, not just potential, but we're already seeing it in the Pacific Islands. Questions around food security, questions around energy security, not just at the state level, but at the household level. I mean, these are all extremely significant social risks, security risks as well, both separate from the security crises that we've been talking about, but also as part of the security crises that we've been talking about. They can both provoke security crises and be provoked by the crises that we've been talking about. And so just quickly to talk about a little in that latter category, I think about low birth rate and issues with workforce retention and recruitment in countries, in Japan, South Korea, Australia, for sure, in the UK, I know. I mean, there's been actual I've heard sort of low-level chatter among the US, Australia, and the UK, like, don't poach our nuclear workers. Like this, they're saying this to each other because, there's, not enough skilled workers, both in terms of university educated, but also tradespeople. And that's just, in the nuclear sphere, that's just one very small slice. I mean, this extends throughout the entire national security community, intelligence, foreign affairs and trade. You could think about how those social and human security issues could provoke crises in the region. I mean, one of the big concerns about North Korea, I know, for China is that if there's a collapse of the North Korean regime, then that could lead to mass, not just an influx into South Korea, but also into China. And that could potentially upset social stability in China, which is the #1 concern of the Chinese Communist Party. And then you think about the food security that is provoked by, I mean, that really underlines both energy and food security, underlines a lot of the concerns over the South China Sea, that about 80% of calories of people in that region around the South China Sea come from the sea. And that if you lose control of your exclusive economic zone, of your continental seabed rights, because someone else has taken them over, then that's not just a matter of face, or it's not just a matter of where your military can operate, but that means that you have less food for your population. And then that can lead into social instability. And so that can provoke countries into becoming more belligerent, more aggressive, less likely to cooperate. And so, understanding the interplay of these human security risks and these sort of hard security crises that we've been talking about, it's extremely important because they can both feed into each other.
Great, thank you so much. And then the other question about how the analysis could have changed, given that there's been some further developments since the interviews which underpin the report were conducted. You will.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll try to be brief. I was just trying to jot down a few off the top of my head, so it's not really a comprehensive review of everything that changed. So just for background, we conducted this from around September to through December last year, and then followed up with discussions, roundtable discussions, and so on. So indeed, there have been some changes. We've seen North Korea renounce the unification goal, for example. That exactly what the implications are for this analysis, I can't really think of on the spot, but there certainly could have some pretty interesting implications for relations going forward. I think one maybe positive thing that happened in November, after we completed most of the interviews, was the summit between US and China, and they began to speak about having talks on arms control, and that even did happen. Although I believe it has stopped now, but that at least has provided some sense of momentary stability to that relationship. So I think that's a positive. Definitely, it has not restored trust, so I should just be clear about that. Because we've also seen more provocations around Taiwan only this week. I've seen some comparisons with the Pelosi visit, which was something that came up a lot. Some Japanese interviewees who mentioned that at the time China fired missiles that landed in the Japanese economic zone. Was that a rehearsal or like a signal to Japan? They think so. I'm not sure if there were any missiles involved in the recent encircling of Taiwan, but still, that's obviously not something that would in any way reduce the risk perceptions for any of the countries in this region. I think, yeah, I mean, we've seen just last night we had the notifications on our phones here in Korea about North Korea sending trash and worse things in balloons over the border. So that's, at least that's new to me, and I've been here for 8 years. But of course, it's something that South Korean government has kind of painted itself in a corner, that they say they're going to respond resolutely to every provocation. So I don't know, if they want my trash, they can have it. But the South Korea-Australia relations, and this is a positive note, is that we've seen the 2+2 dialogue, which I think we cite some critical voices on that one, and we do that for good reason. I believe that there was my sense, speaking with the Australians and South Koreans here, is that there's much work to be done in that area. But they do have the 2+2 dialogue. They issued a statement where they actually said that they were going to explore trilateral talks with Japan. And this is more or less what we're discussing here. So from that point of view, I'm pleased to hear that. Of course, I don't know about the content of those dialogues. And that goes back to also what Maria was saying, that that would be another minilateral. It could be, it would be exclusionary. And it's not just that you exclude potential partners, but you're also excluding the people who you are talking about. And I mean, you could, of course, direct that criticism straight back at this project. That at some point you need to build dialogue structures and security structures that include your enemies or your potential adversaries as well. And just to note that this is something that we're doing at APLN as well. So we're not entirely a club for discussion between various US partners in the region. So I would say that a good sign in that direction is the summit just this last weekend between China, Japan, and Korea. It's good that they are talking to each other. I don't expect that to have any huge impact on anyone's basic security considerations. But there's a huge skepticism towards like talking to China. Do you believe them, and is that going to prevent conflict? But I don't think not talking to them is going to do that either. Of course, this trilateral is very explicitly not about discussing security issues, but they did mention the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, although I understand there was some controversy about how they wanted to use that term. For what it's worth, we also saw a weird North Korean reaction where they criticized the trilateral statement, but they directed the entire criticism towards South Korea. So that could potentially suggest that there's some implicit rebuke of the Chinese position as well. So that's just off the top of my head, and I think we're at time. So thank you all for the excellent input and feedback and pushback and everything else. Very much appreciated.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And just to wrap up, because we are at time, this project has been conducted during a period of heightened geopolitical rivalry and worsening regional developments. And South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the UK have responded to these developments by enhancing their deterrence policies. So it's important to recognize that those policies can trigger reactions from allies and adversaries alike. And so our intention was to do a deep dive into these policy responses and to make sure that these responses don't inadvertently increase the risk of escalation and undermine some of these broader multilateral frameworks that we have in place, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We've had some very thoughtful comments and reactions to the brief overview of the report that we provided. You can find links to the report in the chat. They're available on the European Leadership Network website, as well as the APLN, the Asia Pacific Leadership Network website. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to contact either of our organizations. Thank you to our presenters, thank you to our commentators, and thank you also to the staff who helped to organize this event. We look forward to staying connected with you all, and we hope you have a good rest of your day and evening. Goodbye, everyone, and thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.